we've had, I'll just use the Usher meme last summer. Usher did a Tiny Desk concert for us in the summer of 2022 and did a little funny move when he was performing that then went on to become a meme that went all over the world. We kind of have a similar situation right now with another clip from a Tiny Desk concert that appears to be going viral on social media. And so there's a certain amount of, you have to let the reins of the community, sort of do their thing in terms of sharing elements of our content. But again, I think that can be a double-edged sword, and there are some good elements or good aspects to it when a community or an audience is that inclined to share your message and share your content.
Hi, welcome to another episode of Hard to Market. I'm your host, Brian Mattocks. With me today is Lamar Johnson. Welcome, Lamar.
Hey, good to be with you, Brian.
Lamar, I don't want to steal any thunder here, and I want to make sure you tell the right story. So I'm going to give you a chance to introduce yourself for the audience, so then we can get into some of the nitty-gritty about marketing.
Yep, sounds good. So I'll just start by saying I've been in the marketing space, and specifically in the hard to market space, for over 2 decades now, marketing everything from beverage alcohol to CDs. I was marketing CDs at the very start of the Napster era of the late 1990s, if you can imagine that. And even things like sugary carbonated soft drinks have been part of my career narrative. So just a couple of examples of being in the hard to market space. So I've also been a fan of public media for a number of years since I was a kid. And somehow I found myself in 2020 with an opportunity to become head of sponsorship marketing for National Public Media. So that's what I do. And National Public Media is the sponsorship subsidiary of NPR and is tasked with attracting sponsors across all of NPR's platforms, from podcasting to radio to digital. And so that's essentially what I do on a day-to-day basis. But it is fraught with great opportunity and a lot of amazing properties and programs. But there are some challenges that make NPR a brand that can be hard to market in some instances.
So you mentioned the word sponsorships, and I know, given the relationship for where you guys are in the world, right? We would call that advertising in any other location, but for NPR, NPM, it's sponsorships, right? What does that do in terms of the conversation? How does the fact that it's a sponsorship inform the conversation versus folks that are used to buying advertising?
It really is just really a matter of nomenclature. Essentially, our sponsors are our advertisers. It's just the words that we use. Being in the public media space, we are somewhat conservative in terms of how we describe things and what our guardrails and guidelines are. But it's just a nomenclature thing, essentially. We shy away from the use of words like partners and partnership and really focus on sponsors in terms of how we describe the folks that we appeal to and market to.
But that informs, the fact that it's a sponsorship deeply informs the editorial on the sponsorship kind of spots that people want to run themselves, right? So, you don't just take anybody off the street with their favorite commercial. You guys do a fair amount of legwork there, which definitely sounds like something you have to work with people on, because they're not going to come to the table with something that's editorially what you want to run with.
No, you're absolutely right. Well, what I will say is that as part of that notion of these guardrails and guidelines, there are, some categories that we won't even touch. Political advertising, for example, and advocacy is something that we shy away from. But in terms of sponsors coming to the table, we don't just accept the creative from a potential sponsor. You'll never hear on NPR, a spot that ran on one of the hip hop stations in your local town. NPR is very specific about what's acceptable, and any sponsor message that's featured on NPR is recorded in the unique voice, style, and tone of NPR. So again, we don't just accept anything. Sponsor messages have to go through the NPR process, if you will. And so that's how we sort of maintain that consistency and really maintain that voice that audiences have come to expect from NPR and respect from NPR.
So you have, NPR itself has a ton of brand credibility, and I think that makes part of the conversation probably fairly easy to have. You guys have some pretty great properties there, but when it comes to the hard conversations, like we can't take your creative, or we think that this is the editorial style that we want to speak to. You've got like a really peculiar, you're going to spend a lot of time doing lead gen and acquisition and then goaltending on the other side of it, which is just sounds kind of crazy. How do you manage that balance?
I think sponsors that come to NPR, I would say the vast majority of them know what they're signing up for. NPR is, our research has shown that NPR is the most trusted name in audio news. And so that trust factor goes a long way in terms of what sponsors have come to expect from NPR. But we really do try to balance those masters of, as you said, generating leads. That's what we're here for, ultimately to fuel and empower the engines of NPR's journalism and programming. But again, we have to really balance that with the desire to be protective, if you will, of the brand and sort of maintain a separation of church and state between sponsorship and editorial. That, we don't cross those lines. And so it really is just a fine and delicate balancing act of, really, as you said, goaltending on the backside of things, if you will. Some might consider that to be a challenge, but we're up for the challenge and are used to it. And, over the 50 plus years that NPR has been in existence, it's something, again, that the sponsorship community is very familiar with and doesn't present that big of a challenge because we're used to it.
So you and I were chatting before the show, as is the custom in these things. And you mentioned that you've got like a line around the corner for some of your properties. And then you have other properties where you have to kind of explain to folks, like, you should really sponsor this. It's better for your target demo. How do you direct traffic from the bigger name brands into some of the brands that are either up and coming or have a niche target audience? What does that look like in terms of that conversation from a strategic perspective?
Well, from a strategic perspective, I would say, a lot of that is really dictated by the sponsor in terms of what their target audience is, what their consumer insights are, who they're looking to go after. So our programming and our recommendations from a planning perspective really revolve around what the clients or the sponsor's objectives are from a targeting and audience perspective. The voice of the consumer really has to be at the foundation of everything that both a sponsor wants to do and everything that we want to deliver for a sponsor. And so I would say that's the first consideration. And then the size of audience, the size of a particular show, the qualitative nature of it, what's the content of the show? Is it more news-based in terms of what a sponsor is interested in aligning with? Or is it more culture and conversation and community-based? So we have offerings across the whole gamut from a qualitative perspective, and really rely on what the sponsor's priorities are in terms of developing media plans and event activation plans and things of that nature that fit those sponsors' objectives.
So, we talked the other day when we were chatting about how NPR's got a long and deep and rich history with podcasting as a concept. Tell us a little bit more about that. Listeners may not have an understanding of the history in this space.
Yeah, well, what I'd say to that is, NPR has, as you said, a very long history and really was at the forefront of podcasting a number of years ago. The podcasting space, as you're well aware, is at this moment oversaturated with every type of offering you can imagine. But NPR was really responsible for putting a flag in the ground years ago to say, hey, podcasting is the way of the future for many listeners. and presents just a whole new way of consuming audio on your own, on demand, on your own schedule, versus radio, which was obviously at the foundation of audio for a number of years. As I've said, NPR has been in existence for 52 years now. And so podcasting has just been part of that evolution. And I'm proud to say that, again, NPR was at the forefront of really establishing the podcast category and really benefiting from, again, putting that stake in the ground early. We've had a number of our programs featured as, within the top 20 on the PodTrack rankings for a number of years now. And we're really proud of the fact that we, have such a quantity of programming that's reflected in some of these rankings like PodTrack over the years.
So given your role in marketing, and the history with podcasting, it seems to me like you guys have kind of always have to have your finger on the pulse of what's next so that you can get in front of, putting NPR's brand in these new media spaces as they arise. What's next on your marketing sort of program for NPM and where it's going?
Well, for NPM specifically, it's all about innovation for us. Part of what we like to offer to the sponsorship community is new ways of thinking about how to reach audiences. So, for example, we've used influencers. People might not expect that influencers would be part of a marketing mix for NPR or NPM, but that's one of the things that we have put forth in terms of keeping up with the times. You can make whatever judgment you want about something like using influencers, but it's the way of the future. They do carry influence. They are able to message. And so we have found some success in utilizing these sort of newer approaches to getting the marketing message out.
It's funny. Everybody throws shade at influencers, but nobody was throwing shade at movie stars back in the 80s, right? I don't really understand the difference. It just so happens that these guys started on YouTube as opposed to in the theater. Maybe
exactly. And I think the word influencers is loaded in a lot of people's minds. Maybe they feel like there's some nefarious intent there, but influencing has been going on for a long time, as you said. And just again, sort of in the spirit of acknowledging nomenclature, I prefer to use the phrase broadcast towers. It doesn't really carry the same baggage as influencers. People get all stuck on the word influencers. But anyway, I use broadcast towers, but the point still carries in terms of these people have audiences, they're able to influence, they're evangelistic and carry the power of word of mouth. And so, we have done, again, some work with them and really found success in terms of influencers being able to amplify a message, get a message to a new audience. That's part of our overarching objective for national public media and ultimately for NPR. And that is to continue to attract younger and more diverse audiences to NPR's programming.
I find that that's interesting. How are you balancing the editorial standards of NPR, which are, obviously robust? We talked about that a little bit already, with some of these ultra short media formats where, you don't get the chance to dive in. You don't get a chance to tell a full story. You get 30 seconds here, you get the TikToks kind of, streams, you get the reels. How are you balancing all of that and still essentially offering that for sponsorship opportunities as well? I mean, what does that look like?
The short form piece of it, I think, is one of the things that we're continuing to figure out, for lack of a better word. There are conversations around here regarding TikTok, and we try to keep that finger on the pulse. I just saw something the other day about the fact that Clubhouse, do you remember Clubhouse about a year or so came and went like in the twinkle of an eye?
Yeah, but just like Threads.
For a moment, we were considering and looking at the Clubhouse, and I use Clubhouse as just an example of keeping an open mind to exploring what's next is key to success in this game. And so, as I said, TikTok is on our list for figuring out how to crack that nut. Obviously, other social media channels are part of our mix, and there is some short form content that we've featured on some of our other social media platforms. But it really is a balancing act, and we are continuing to learn as we go in terms of how to tell stories in that super short format that younger and more diverse audiences are accustomed to.
Yeah, it's it seems to be a very interesting dynamic as well, in that now with NPR's content being distributed across platforms where you have decreasing amounts of control, having sponsorships gets a little bit more challenging too, right? YouTube, for example, is that place where you can control what those sponsorships look like. So I imagine you're keeping your footprints limited in those spaces. Is that right?
That is right in that specific instance, but there are other channels where we have a little bit more leeway and control. But absolutely, there are some that can be challenging in terms of sponsor messaging and some that are a little more open. So, yep, you're absolutely right.
So with that, you guys are essentially, from a content perspective, you have to play again the goaltender again, guarding your content from redistribution. That just dilutes your sponsorship value prop if
Exactly.
other folks are essentially taking your stuff and throwing it on different media distribution platforms. What's
Exactly.
the how from a marketing perspective, how is that influencing your strategy with the content creation that you're doing, in terms of, are you doing anything specific to prevent that? Are you using the DMCA to pull back so you can make sure that you can retain control? What does that look like? I mean, without causing like Streisand effect stuff.
Well, a lot of that is really dictated and managed on the NPR side.
Yeah.
From an editorial and content perspective. And so I would defer to them in terms of, what those processes are. To be honest with you, I'm not that close to it from a technical perspective. But it's something that we're mindful of, and it's something obviously to be considered. But, we do recognize the fact that NPR content is very relevant and people have that aspiration of sharing our stuff. There's, again, I hate to keep using this notion of a balancing act, but there is an aspect of virality or the viral nature of things where people will take something and just post it and run with it. And there's only so much control that you can have in some of those instances. But that can also potentially be a good thing. I'll give you an example of that. Less focused on the advertising aspect of it and more on the culture and conversation. We've had, I'll just use the Usher meme last summer. Usher did a Tiny Desk concert for us in the summer of 2022 and did a little funny move when he was performing that then went on to become a meme that went all over the world. We kind of have a similar situation right now with another clip from a Tiny Desk concert that appears to be going viral on social media. And so there's a certain amount of, you have to let the reins of the community, sort of do their thing in terms of sharing elements of our content. But again, I think that can be a double-edged sword, and there are some good elements or good aspects to it when a community or an audience is that inclined to share your message and share your content on their own.
It's going to move you from sponsorships to product placement at that point, because you really won't have any other choice.
I'm going to use an even deeper word. So moving from sponsorship to product placement, but I like to use the word cultural participation. That's where the power lies. If a brand or a media company or a content producer or publisher can participate in culture, you've hit the jackpot. And that's one of the things that I'm so proud of in terms of working at NPM on behalf of NPR, is that our work, on both sides, helps brands participate in culture, a marketer's dream. So yeah,
absolutely.
So I love that.
That's fully engaged content. We had somebody on the show not long ago that spoke to experiential marketing and creating these experiences. And I think you're starting to see that creep more and more into the dynamic for marketers. And I think what you're talking about is right there with it. So Lamar, as we start to wrap here, I want to ask a couple key questions. One,
sure.
I mean, obviously the brand speaks for itself. You've done a ton of legwork, but you've also got this really, really powerful history. But who should reach out to you, and how should they get a hold of you if they want to speak to you specifically at NPM or in NPM family at large to talk about sponsorship?
Yep. I would say, in terms of reaching out to me directly, they can reach out to me a number of ways. I'll give you my email address. It's ljohnson, JOHNSON, and the number 1. So ljohnson1 at npr.org. I would say that's the best way to reach out, and I can help triage and put folks in touch with the right sponsorship sales folks on our side,
Great.
or spot sales folks and what have you. I'd also encourage folks to visit our website, nationalpublicmedia.com, and just browse and check out what we have to offer. There's a pretty robust website, and it's targeted to the sponsorship community, obviously, and hopefully can answer any questions that folks may have. And then the first part of your question, in terms of who should be reaching out to us, really anyone who's looking to engage with what I call our highly coveted audience. We have a highly educated, affluent, very influential, evangelistic even audience that, again, are a marketer's dream. And so anyone who is looking to engage with an audience like that, I would say, a diverse audience that is increasingly more and more diverse as each day passes, there's that opportunity for brands that are looking to engage with those types of audiences. And so I'd encourage folks who are looking to find those opportunities, looking for a trusted media partner that's brand safe, that presents messages in an uncluttered environment. I could go on for hours, but if that's what a sponsor is looking for, NPM and NPR is the place to come.
Awesome. And through your hard to market past and all of the places you've been, what are the three biggest kind of takeaways you've had in your journey so far that have made you the success that you are?
Oh, wow. I would say the three things I've learned so far that are most important, I would say the ability to, again, identify insights that lead to cultural participation opportunities. That's where I've had the most success in terms of my career. Finding that little nugget of something that is maybe very, very unique, or even just below the surface from a consumer insights perspective, and then amplifying that into an offering or a program that allows a brand to participate in culture. That's the first thing I would say is the at the foundation of what I've learned over the years. The other thing I would say is just possessing the ability to be nimble and agile, the ability to turn on a dime. So, whether that has to do with, identifying someone as an influencer, and God forbid if something goes wrong, the ability to pivot and have somebody in your back pocket. I'll just use that as an example. Yeah. Or, in the instance of, I'm going to use the example of NPR, the NPR news cycle. There are, when you're involved in news media, you have to be able to sort of pivot and be agile and nimble, so that if something in the news cycle perhaps can get in the way of a sponsor message, or might be something that a sponsor may not want to associate with, have to be nimble and work. We work very closely with our colleagues at NPR to make sure that we maintain that agility, so that if the news cycle gets in the way, we can pivot and make sure that a sponsor's message is either delayed or removed or what have you. The other thing that I'll just mention in that notion of the news cycle is, because we're an audio media company, the brands still come to us, even in spite of that whole notion of the news cycle and what that can potentially involve, because there aren't visuals associated with it. So there is a certain element of brand safety, even within, sponsoring news programming, because there aren't. I'll just use the example of the war that is obviously unfolding as we speak. There aren't visuals associated with that. So that's kind of a unique thing, but I digress. My point in all of that was just being able to be nimble and agile in the news media space, I would say would be number two, and also has been a hallmark of my career. And then the third one would be that size doesn't always trump quality. And so people, sometimes get stuck on, I want the biggest audience. I want the widest reach, the biggest, the shiniest thing. But there's something to be said for the qualitative aspect of sponsorship, kind of in that spirit of what I was saying about the voice of the consumer and cultural participation. Size does not always trump quality. So if perhaps I'm just going to make this up, a podcast that has a niche audience, but has a strong community, a strong sense of culture, and a strong conversation within its audience.
Mm.
If that audience happens to be smaller, you might find more success as a sponsor by tapping into that audience or that program versus going for the biggest with the widest reach. So keeping an open mind to this notion of size may be trumped by quality. So I would say those are the three things.
That's awesome. And I think I want to thank you so much for being on the show today. This has been great. I think our listeners are definitely going to resonate with the things you said. The cultural participation piece, particularly, I think is just fantastic for where marketing is going, long term. So thank you so much again for being on our show today.
Thank you, Brian. It really was my pleasure, and I hope folks enjoyed our little talk.